You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Elly Griffiths on the show with me today. She has a phenomenal new book. It's called The Locked Room. And guys, you know, I love thrillers. It's probably one of my go-to genres. When I picked this book up and read it, it just sucked me down the rabbit hole. This is so much fun. A little prescient for the time that we've just lived through, but I think you're going to love it as much as I did. Welcome to the show, Elly.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to have you. Elly, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, do you know, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking it's all to do with, for me, it's kind of all to do with Starsky and Hutch, because when I was at school, I loved Starsky and Hutch, and I used to write like little episodes of Starsky and Hutch for my friends. You know, I'd kind of, you know, just in longhand, just sort of write down what would happen in the episode. And I do remember one week I killed off Starsky. Which was, you know, I know, and he was my favorite too. I don't know what I was thinking. Anyhow, in this little story, I killed Starsky, and I remember my friends reading it at school, and some of them started to cry. and you know, I quite liked that. I guess it was more that I sort of thought, oh, I wonder if I can do this. You know, I thought I might just have worked out how to do that. And it's silly, isn't it? Because it's only really the order in which you put words on a page. It can make you laugh, or it can make you cry. And I suddenly thought, oh, I might know how to do this. So I think that was the first moment, although I'd kind of, you know, maybe always wanted to be a writer. That was my first moment of thinking, oh, maybe I can do this.
Wow. Well, and as a series author, you know that you can't just kill off a title character.
No, don't worry. I mean, Ruth and Nelson are safe. But wasn't I brave? I was probably braver than I am now, just to kill off Starsky. But, you know, it was, I don't think there was much plot. I just think it was Starsky died, Hutch is sad, you know. So I think I've got better at plotting.
That's delving into Game of Thrones territory there if you start killing off favorite characters.
Isn't it? Yes. And you know, that's very brave when that happens. But I have to say that's not going to happen to my main character, Ruth.
So from that early, you know, writing fan fiction experience and realizing that you could hold people's emotions in your hands and you could, you know, make them laugh or make them cry and the power that comes from that thought. I think we've all experienced that. You know, from that moment to then becoming a professional author who is published and who is you know, your career is telling these stories. There's usually a lot of life that happens between those two moments, and I love to talk about the circuitous path of authors. Rarely have I met, you know, I've done more than I think we're up on 1,300 author interviews now, and I can count on one hand, two maybe, the people that said they wanted to be an author and that's the only career path they ever pursued. It just everything just happened the way they planned for it to. It doesn't happen like that for most people. What was your path to you know, deciding to write your first book and get it published, and where were you in life when that was happening?
That's so true, isn't it? And I think it's one of the lovely things about writing.
Yes.
That most people have done other things, haven't they? They've been sort of doctors or journalists or taxi drivers. People have usually done other things. And I am quite often going to schools and do talks and kids often ask, oh, how do I become a writer? And it's quite a nice question because, of course, there's no one way, is there? And there's no exam you take and there's no career path. So I kind of do love that about writing. And yeah, it was exactly the same with me. So I probably wanted to be a writer probably from that moment of writing that Starsky and Hutch story when I was about 15. But I kind of did all the things that you might do. I read English at university, then I worked in a library for a while. But really, my career was in publishing. I went to work for HarperCollins in the UK as a publicity assistant, and I ended up as editorial director for children's fiction. So I was publishing children's fiction, and it was a great, it was a great job. I worked with some great writers, people like Michael Morpurgo and Lynn Reed Banks, and was really fulfilling, but it sort of made me forget that I actually wanted to write the books myself. So I didn't write what became my first published book until I was on maternity leave. And I've got twins who are 24. So I guess that was 25 years ago. I started to write what became my first published book. But it was published under my real name, which I don't know if you know, my real name is Domenica De Rosa. So it sounds made up. I know my real name. My real name sounds exactly like a pseudonym, but it is my real name. My dad was Italian. And so I eventually had that book published as Domenica De Rosa, and it was called The Italian Quarter. And it was kind of a little bit about my dad's life as an Italian immigrant in London. So that was my first published book. But yes, it came after a kind of long, circuitous route, and I was kind of in the world of publishing, but I wasn't actually writing the books myself. So yeah, it took quite a long time.
Well, I love that you worked in publishing because, and I know a few writers who worked in publishing to begin with, and I hear kind of two different stories, and sometimes the experience is valid. Both experiences are valid, but some people say that that working in publishing sort of pulled back the curtains and exposed the industry of publishing to them and kind of demystified a lot of the experience, because you see that it is attainable, and it's attainable by people just like me in a lot of cases. So if they can do it, then surely I can do it, because it's an industry, and people work in industries, and it's a job, that, like, of course there's a lot of woo-woo and a lot of mysticism in writing, but at the end of the day it's a job, and people do jobs. So demystifying is kind of one aspect of it, but the other aspect, and you touched on this a minute ago, is that you can get so involved in the industry, in the machine of it all, that you forget to realize that was your dream in the beginning, and it kind of, your dream gets consumed by the daily job of it all. What was it was it maternity leave that you had time on your hands and you kind of separated from the daily work of it all? Was that what kind of reignited that spark for you?
I think it was, and I think it's really true that I suppose editing is quite creative, so maybe I was using that creative side of me to edit other people's books. But I suppose I still thought that I would like to publish. But as you sort of said in the first bit of your question, publishing it's an industry, isn't it? And it's about money, and publishers publish books to make money, and that's not wrong. That's their job.
Sure.
So it does make you a little bit scared about doing that yourself. You can imagine your book. I suppose I had a really strong imagination of my book going to the sort of acquisitions meeting and people saying, well, should we publish this, or I don't know. And I could imagine that so clearly. It did slightly put me off trying myself, and I think maternity leave did give me a bit of a space from that world and a bit of time to think. I didn't finish the book on maternity leave. My twins are about 4 when I finished it, so you did give me a little time to think about it. So I think it was useful working publishing, because I could imagine that I still can what those meetings are like. We talk about when they talk about the cover and they talk about the book, but that's also a bad thing, because I can imagine people saying, "Oh, I don't think much of this one," and so I can easily. Writers are very good at catastrophizing. Oh, I don't know if I've said that right. You know what I mean? Think of the
Yeah.
worst case scenario, and I
Right.
can totally just imagine everyone groaning at a meeting saying, "Oh, not another one from her." So you have to stamp down that bit of your imagination.
You said that the first book that you published under your real name, Domenica de Rosa, and it was a nod sort of to your father's life, and it was a story that was close to your personal experiences. You drew on some real life elements, but of course it was fictional. But you were able to draw on things that you knew from that. I heard a story about how Elly Griffiths was born, though, and it came from a mystical story idea, if you will, and then from that story, the need for a different name came about. Could you tell us that story about that first book idea and how the pen name of Elly was born?
Yes, of course. So I wrote 4 books as Domenica de Rosa, and they were all kind of about Italy, family, relationships, that sort of thing.
Sure.
But then I had an idea for a different sort of book, and it was going to be about archaeology. And the reason for that is that my husband Andy had a career change. So when I met him, he was a lawyer. And I actually met him in a city wine bar, if you can imagine, in London. He was there with all his lawyer friends, and I was there with my publishing friends. And I remember at some point in the evening, he said, "Oh, I didn't really want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be an archaeologist." And I thought, "Oh, that's so sweet." So we got married. And then when we were married and we had 2 young children, he said, "Oh, do you remember that thing about being an archaeologist? I'd kind of like to do it now." And it did seem a bit less sweet, I can tell you. So Andy went back to university, and he studied archaeology, and it became an interest for both of us. And one day we were walking across Titchwell Marsh, which is a marshland on the North Norfolk coast there, with our young children, because when he went back to university, we couldn't afford those lovely Tuscan holidays before that had inspired my Italy book. So we went back to Norfolk, and the reason why we went to Norfolk was because my aunt lives there, and I'd always spent a lot of time with my aunt when I was a child, and she has a boat which is on the Norfolk Broads, on the rivers there. So we went back to having those sort of holidays with her. And Andy and I were walking across Titchwell Marsh, and Andy happened to say that prehistoric people had thought that marshland was sacred because it's neither land nor sea, but something in between. They thought of it as a bridge to the afterlife, neither land nor
Right.
sea, neither life nor death, like a liminal zone, an in-between place.
Right.
And as
So
soon as
kind
he
of
said,
in the same way that they held dawn and sunset as sacred because it's the time between times. It's
yes,
fully day, not fully night.
yes, exactly. And of course, we're talking on the summer solstice, aren't we? On the
Right.
21st
Yes,
of
we are.
June. It's exactly the day to talk about this. But yes,
Right.
exactly. It's this whole idea of the landscape itself kind of being sacred and special. Um, and as soon as he said that this idea for a book came into my head, and I did sort of see. I'm sorry to say this because it sounds so sort of cliched, but I did sort of see Dr. Ruth Galloway walking towards me out of the mist. I sort of felt I knew everything about her. Just where she'd been to school, where she'd been to college, who her friends were. And I wrote the crossing places sort of quite quickly and showed it to my agent. And she said, "Oh, this is crime. You need a crime name." So I became Elly Griffiths almost on the spur of the moment, but it was my grandmother's name. She was Ellen Griffiths. And I don't know why we decided on Elly. I think it just looked a bit tidier on the book covers. But so, I became Elly Griffiths from that moment on, really.
Wow, that is such an amazing story. I love when stories and not all books come this way, dear listeners. But sometimes they just kind of spring to life out of nothing, and which is fascinating to me. Because one of the things that I love to get people to talk about is that first moment of inspiration for a book, like where stories come from. Because one moment they don't exist at all, and then something triggers something, and then this whole story is birthed, and then it's your job as the writer to shine it up and to to dig it out of the ground, and whatever metaphor you want to use. But they just kind of spring to life out of nothing. Have you ever had another experience like that one, where the story and characters just kind of walk out of the ether?
I've never had it in quite the same way, and I've never had a character appear to me in quite the same way that Ruth did. But I have had very sort of strong feelings, and it is so interesting, isn't it? Because
Yes.
every book is different, every writer's different, but then even every book by every writer is different. So sometimes it's been the place, like I remember driving across Norfolk and going past an abandoned airfield, and that gave me the idea for the ghost fields, just seeing this place that looked very spooky in the twilight. And I think there was a pub nearby called the Hourglass, and I just thought, wow, imagine being there, imagine flying a plane, not knowing you're going to come back, and then drinking in a pub called the Hourglass. That just seems so sort of poignant. So that gave me the idea for that book. But sometimes you've got a little bit of an idea, haven't you, and you're worrying away at it, and you're thinking, how can I make this into a book? And so it is, every book is different, and sometimes I think that you need one idea for a book and three for a crime novel. So sometimes I think I've got three separate ideas, but they all turn out to be one book. And I think that was what happened to me with the Stranger Diaries, actually, that all the ideas eventually came together.
So this character that walked out of the mist, to you, Ruth Galloway. Tell me about Ruth. What is it that, and if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I am, but this is book 14 in the Ruth series. That is amazing to have a character that can carry forth for that many stories. One is amazing. But what is it about the character of Ruth that resonates so deeply with people?
It is funny, isn't it? Because some characters are great characters, but you just know you can't keep writing about them.
Right.
And I think I kind of did know from the start that Ruth was a character I could keep writing about, and also that her relationship with the policeman in the books, DCI Nelson, would be a kind of complicated one and would be a kind of long relationship. Although, of course, I didn't know when I wrote that first book that I'd have the chance to write it. And I do feel really grateful to my publishers, Quercus in the UK and HarperCollins, now Mariner in the US, because they stuck with me for 14 books to tell this sort of long story. But Ruth is a forensic archaeologist. She teaches at a university, a made-up university. I thought I'd better make up a university, although people still sometimes write and tell me I put it in the wrong place, but it is made up. Teaches up a made-up university in Norfolk, and she's asked by a policeman, DCI Harry Nelson, as an expert to come and look at some buried bones. And I knew from Andy, this is something that forensic archaeologists actually do. They can look at bones and see how and why they were buried. So she looks at these bones and realizes that they're over 2,000 years old, but she's drawn into the case and into a very complicated relationship with Nelson. And I do think the fact that she's an archaeologist has helped, because it means that I can kind of roam across the centuries and the millennia in the books. There's always, it helps that they're in Norfolk, because Norfolk is an incredibly fascinating place. Have you ever been there?
I have not.
You should visit, Hank. It's a beautiful part of England.
I would love to.
It's very historic. It's also quite spooky in places. There's beautiful coastal views, but very old ancient cities. It's lovely. So Norfolk itself, it helps, because there's so many stories about Norfolk, so many legends, so many ghosts, really, so much archaeology. I think it's the part of Britain that has the most archaeology. So there's that. So I kind of hope to avoid that trap, the Midsummer Murders trap, where you have one small part of the country that's kind of unfeasibly full of bodies. So, I think making you an archaeologist means that, Norfolk is full of bodies, but some of them have been buried for hundreds and thousands of years. So I think that sort of helps, the fact that she's an archaeologist, the fact that it's in Norfolk. And I think she maybe is just a character who I've come to, like and know better, and she's a kind of complicated character, so I think that helps sort of carry the books. And of course her relationship with Nelson is complicated, and that helps. And also helps that 14 books on, of course, now there's a big cast of other characters, so that's something else. You could, if I was only to write one book about Ruth, I would never have got to explore Cathbad and Clough and Judy and all those other characters. So again, I feel quite privileged to be able to do that, to write so many books.
Well, having a character that is an archaeologist, it, a lot of times when you're writing crime thrillers, you need the inciting incident, if we want to call it that, to kind of be in your face and to uh, be visceral in certain ways. But a lot of times you're talking about you're dealing with a character who is digging up mysteries, and that's a different kind of storytelling when you're solving cold cases in a lot of ways, as opposed to the kind of visceral thing that happened last night.
Yes, definitely. And of course, in some of the books I have both. I'll have a corpse on the first pages, like you're always told to in crime fiction, and sometimes not. Sometimes yes, that the body's been dead for many years, and it is kind of digging down through those layers, isn't it? But I find that really interesting, because then you can look at sort of the history of the case and really the history of the place as well, and they're usually sort of some buried secrets buried there alongside the body. So I do enjoy that part of it. I think most of the books have a kind of a crime, a murder that happens in present day, and then there is some sort of link with a case that's happened a long time ago. So in the locked room, there are a series of murders, well, that look like suicides, but Nelson thinks they might be murders. And then there's also the case of a plague victim whose bones Ruth has sort of recently dug up, and there are links between the two. So it's finding the links, actually, that's both a challenge and one of the really fun bits about writing the books.
So, Ellie, I don't know if you've noticed or not, but for the last couple of years, we've been dealing with a global pandemic that has that has affected people in a number of ways. A lot of writers that I've talked to have chosen to not address that topic in their fiction, and to let their fiction be an escape from the reality that we've all presently live through. Um, in this book, you decide to not only address this head on, but to use it as a plot device. Um, First off, tell me. Well, first off, how has this pandemic affected you and your creative life? Because as we know, most writers spend the majority of their life working in an office all alone, telling stories to themselves, until they turn them into their editor and their publisher. But the rest of the world has been locked down along with us, which is another sort of mental stress that people have been going through, knowing that the rest of the world is doing the same thing that we're doing. But so first off, how did you and your family do during the pandemic, and why did you choose to bring your characters into this reality?
Well, I suppose, like a lot of writers, I felt that I was very lucky during the pandemic, actually, because I had a world to escape to. I had my little shed in the garden, which is where I'm speaking to you now, that I could escape to. And obviously, it was a time of great worry, an awful time, but in retrospect, for me, it was sort of quite a golden time, because I was here. My our grown-up children who were at university came back for the first lockdown, so we were all here, and we do yoga in the garden, as Ruth does in the book. We binge watch lots of telly. We went on long walks. I'm really lucky to live near the sea, so we walked to the sea most days. And I was very conscious that lots of people, health workers and teachers and retail workers weren't having this sort of lockdown. But really, for me, it wasn't too bad. But there was that awful sense of uncertainty as well that went through it all. And I wasn't sure at first whether I was going to cover it in the book. And the trouble is, mind you, I was just listening to your chat with Hannah Mae McKinnon, who's great. I love her books. She wrote 3 books in lockdown. I felt quite inadequate listening to her talking.
I think we all did.
But I kind of knew that I would have to decide, because I was contracted to write a book a year, that I have to decide quite quickly whether I was going to cover lockdown. So the Night Hawks, which was book 13, was the book actually written in lockdown. And that's kind of full of longing for sort of Norfolk and places that I couldn't go to really. But I knew that the next one I'd have to make the decision because the Night Hawks ends in December 2019. So I knew that I have to make a decision whether or not to cover lockdown. And I did wonder whether people would want to read about it, whether people just wanted a break. But in the end, I thought that as I'd written a book about Ruth every year for 14 years, it sort of felt wrong to miss it out. It sort of felt wrong to miss out COVID and lockdown. And I thought when I looked back on the series, I might feel, an opportunity had been missed in a way. And I did read that very few fiction writers wrote about the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. And, it just isn't in many books, in many fictional books. So I thought that would be a shame if that were true. So I decided to cover it, and I decided to have Ruth and Nelson in lockdown. And and I know that all maybe sounds a bit high-minded, but of course another part of me thought, what an opportunity, what an
Right.
opportunity these characters who've been kept apart by various forces, now they could either be kept apart by lockdown or brought together by lockdown. And like a lot of crime writers, I'm really fascinated by locked room mysteries. And I thought, well, here's the whole country in its own, the whole world almost in its own locked room mystery. So those were the considerations, when I started to write the book. But, it was tough. It was tough for me to relive it in a way. I kept a diary, always kept a diary, but particularly kept one during lockdown. So even looking back on it, I don't know if you found that, but something weird's happened to our memories, hasn't it? Because
Yes.
2020 just seems decades away, really. So I was glad that I'd kept the diary because I could remember what those days were like. So in the end, it was very challenging to write it, but I am glad I did.
Well, it's and the title itself is a nod to those great,
Yeah.
Agatha Christie locked room mysteries that we all love and adore.
Yes.
When the elements of the story first started coming together for you, and you started, realizing, I am going to address this global pandemic head on, and I'm going to bring it into the story. How did the other pieces start coming together for you?
Well, I sort of had always wanted to set a book in the centre of Norwich, which is a sort of the main city in Norfolk. And there's an area around the cathedral that's called Tombland. Actually, genuinely is called Tombland. And in fact, the wonderful C.J. Sanson wrote a book called Tombland about this area in the 16th century. And rather disappointingly, though, actually, it comes from, I think, an old Anglo-Saxon word meaning empty space. So it's not quite as spooky as it sounds. But so I always wanted to set a story around there. And I started looking into it, and I found that that Norwich, the centre of Norwich, had gone through two big epidemics of the plague, one in the 13th century, one in the 16th century. And so I knew that would be a sort of a parallel that I could draw in the books, to look at Norwich in the plague years, and to look at it in during lockdown, because there was a form of lockdown, and horribly, it was basically people being sort of bricked into the houses if they had the plague. And there was a terrible story that I came across when I was researching the book, that there was a house in Norwich that was sealed up during the plague because the inhabitants were ill, were sick with the plague. And then when they unsealed it, they find the bodies of a man, a woman, and a young girl. And it seemed like the young girl might have eaten her parents' flesh to try and stay alive. It's a really horrible story. But her ghost walks Tombland, and she's called the Grey Lady. So I kind of knew that had to come into the book as well. So there were lots of interesting historical parallel. Even they had characters, people called watchers, and they would go around checking that people were socially distancing. And they carried a long stick. I don't know if it was 2 meters long, but it was basically to keep people apart. So all those things, had to go into the book, really.
Wow. It's so funny that, the old saying, and I guess King Solomon said it first, that there's nothing new under the sun. I guess that really is true, isn't it?
It really is true. And I think it's something very interesting, isn't it? When you you look at history or archaeology or something like that, it's seeing those parallels really. And
Right.
we think things are new. We think our experiences are new. And also, it's easy to imagine that people who lived a long, long time ago didn't have the same emotions as us. But of course they
Right.
did. Of course they were scared. Of course, they were worried about their loved ones. There are all these analogies. Really, it's one of the wonderful things about writing about the past, I think.
Well, they just didn't have smartphones to tweet about what they were feeling.
No, they didn't. Although I do quote Julian of Norwich, who's a famous a poet writing in the 1300s. I think she was the first woman, certainly the first woman in Britain to be published as a poet. But she wrote about the plague, and she wrote about her religious experiences from the plague. So maybe that was the 13th century equivalent of tweeting about it.
Oh, Ellie, you mentioned earlier that with your previous book, you knew that you were at the end of 2019, and then with the locked room, you're bringing us into more of the current time. Um, it because you are following natural time in a lot of cases with these. Ruth Galloway and company are aging, and they are going through life like the rest of us. Um, how are you tracking Ruth through this series of books, and does the seasons of life, does that affect the story? I guess what I'm asking is how is the character continuing to develop, as she ages, as she goes through life like the rest of us are?
That's a great question. I think it is again one of the great sort of privileges really of getting to write so much about one group of characters. So Ruth started off the same age as me, but now I think she's a bit younger. Somehow that's happened. But though she has followed in real time, I think, because a couple of books take place over the same year or something. So yeah, she's now in her 50s, and her daughter. It's particularly when I look at her daughter Kate, actually, that I think, just like you do with your own children, wow, where's that time gone? Because
Right.
Kate is 11 in the locked room, and I vividly remember the book in which she was born. So that marks out time, as again as it does with our own children. But I find it quite quite fun and interesting, challenging as well, to write about characters as they're aging. And one of the things is, of course, Nelson, the detective character, is now facing the kind of spectre, well, to him it is a spectre of retiring. And at one time, police officers, and I've got a police advisor, as lots of writers have, a wonderful man called Graham Bartlett, and he had to retire at 50. And you think of all the experience that he had. That seems crazy to me, but he was sort of forced to retire. But now that isn't the case. Now officers aren't forced to retire, but there is a bit of pressure on them to retire. And Nelson gets a lot of pressure from his boss, with whom he doesn't get on so well, sort of dynamic woman known as Super Joe. And she would quite like him to retire so she could bring in a fresh new bit of new blood into the department. So I wanted to write about that, and what happens with the next challenge. I think Ian Rankin's done it really well with Rebus, that he is now older, and he's not very well, and he's walking around with his little dog, and he's short of breath. And I think he's done that very well, because he hasn't shied away from, I guess there is that temptation to keep your characters the same as ever, but actually, if you do let them age, I think that makes it a bit more satisfying, really.
Right. Well, the 14th Ruth Galloway mystery book, The Locked Room, when you're hearing this, is available everywhere, and you need to go grab it today. This is a book you need to have. We'll have links to it in the show notes, where you can grab the Kindle edition or the audiobook or the hardcover if you want to hold the paper in your hand, or go visit your local bookstore and definitely keep local bookstores in business. Give them your business. Ellie, what do you think about the audiobook treatment for your books? Over the last 5 years or so, especially, audiobooks are just skyrocketing, and the biggest growth market in publishing right now is audio. How do you feel about your books being translated into this form?
Isn't it interesting how that market has grown? I think it's really interesting. Well,
Yes.
when lockdown happened, One of the things that I thought I might do is on just on my Facebook page. I thought I'd read my first Ruth book, The Crossing Places, aloud, just live on the. You know, it was very low tech. I just filmed myself on my phone because I just remember when I was young. You know, when my mum used to read to me, it was very comforting and really nice. And I thought we all needed a bit of comfort, and it might be a nice thing to do. And it really was. I read a chapter a day, but my goodness, it gave me a great respect for those audio artists, those voice artists.
It's a lot of work.
Oh,
for sure.
It's so difficult, and this is my own book, and you know, I found it quite difficult. Sometimes I thought, who's speaking, whose voice am I meant to be doing, and all those things. And you know that they're so good. I'm absolutely in awe of them. You know, and you know the different audio versions in the US and the UK are both sort of amazing. And also, you know, foreign language ones as well. So I really think it's an amazingly good thing that this new market has grown up, and it is just comforting, isn't it, hearing somebody read to you? I love it.
Absolutely. I love it too. The Locked Room, Ruth Galloway Mystery Series, book 14, out everywhere now. Go grab it. You won't be disappointed. Elly, Dominica, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.